Shecky Show. We got this groovy podcast for ya. Reviewing crazy tunes or quoting Twain and Sting and Dune. We'll bring ideas to share like bonus points for extra flair, cause it's the frickin' Dave and Shecky Show. Dave and Shecky Show, we're bringing you this groovy review. We might preview movies, bake some bread, or drink some smoothies. So come on, have way too much caffeine. You roll up some rivers, I'll reference some Raffy. This is the Dave and Shecky Show.
Ready? What? Are you ready? Every good jazz song starts out with the band leader going, "Okay, ready?"
No one, I don't believe that.
Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, everybody. I'm going to count it off, but it's on 2 and 4. Are you ready?
All right. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to episode number 45 of the Middle-Aged Cool Kids Super Terrific Podcast, featuring your pals
Symphony Sid and Jazz Bo Collins.
Oh, all right. Well, I don't know which one I'm at the present time.
Perhaps I can help you.
I would rather be Jazz Bo than Sid.
Jazz Bo was the hippest.
Yeah, I figured that. I figured Jazz Bo was way hipper than Sid. Anyway.
Coming to you from the Purple Grotto.
Oh. So today's episode is all about the jazz. Dave fancies himself quite the jazz hep cat. So I figured he would give us some of his knowledge, drop some of his jazz truth bombs, as it were, much like he did with funk. This one's a little harder sell for me because there are aspects of jazz that I cannot hear, I cannot listen to. It is not pleasant at all to me.
That's because the Chinese took it over in the 1940s.
The Chinese.
And that's, you can ask Louis Armstrong about that.
I would, but I hear he's passed away.
Louis Armstrong called bebop Chinese music.
He did?
Yeah, and that just goes to show you that every generation can't relate to the next generation.
So bebop isn't jazz?
Well, not according to Louis Armstrong.
I see. You see,
the new breed came in, and he was a little bit threatened. He didn't quite understand what they were doing, and to him it was like speaking Chinese.
Oh, I see. Not the actual Chinese.
Well, he just didn't understand their language.
I see. So let's start from the very get-go. Where do you think jazz started?
Jazz started in New Orleans.
Uh-huh. How?
Jazz somehow started in New Orleans. I don't know why it didn't start somewhere else, but that seems to be where it is recognized as starting. And jazz has its origin in Dixieland music and also in street marches and bands that would play at funerals. The funeral bands would play marching band jazz, Dixieland. And they didn't even have bass players then. They had the tuba was the bass player because you could walk with a tuba. And you walk. One guy would hold the bass drum, another guy would hold the snare. It's like a swinging marching band. So some of the first jazz was celebratory music, sort of as honoring the dead. Not celebrating the death, but celebrating their life through music. You know what I mean?
So tell me how Dixieland goes. We go from Dixieland. Is there anybody that was prominent in Dixieland? Is there like the father of Dixieland?
Well, yeah, there's a number of cats. One person is Bix Beiderbecke.
What?
Bix Beiderbecke. Bix Beiderbecke. what I know, Bix Beiderbecke might have had a little bit of a drinking problem.
Okay, well, that was, by the way, Bix Beiderbecke, I'm Coming, Virginia from 1927.
All right, now that would have a whole nother meaning in today's music.
All right, I don't know about that. It says here this guy plays the cornet.
Cornet is like a smaller trumpet.
Ah, okay.
It has a softer tone than trumpet. Terra Masahino plays the cornet.
Oh, he does?
Yes.
I did not know. Is that a jazz staple still, I guess?
Yeah, if you play trumpet, you might play cornet, but no, I mean, it's,
Is it the same notes, just different tone?
I don't know exactly. I'm not positive of that. It might even be in a different key, I'm not sure. And then there's another cat named Sidney Bechet. Check him out for a second. That's jazz, okay? Now that was music. That music sounded pleasing.
Yes.
If you can't understand that music, I don't understand why you wouldn't understand it. There's no mystery there. And there's another cat too. And now this is the trumpet player who really kind of influenced Louis Armstrong. What's his name? The trumpet player. King Oliver. And these are all pre-Louis Armstrong, who is kind of, I guess, takes the crown as the founder of or like the head of New Orleans jazz. Guys aspired to be in King Oliver's band. Like if you could get a chair in his band, you had basically made it. But am I mistaken now? Is King Oliver out of St. Louis?
He moved to New Orleans in his youth, it says in Wikipedia.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, New Orleans is basically the birthplace of jazz, if you want to really get technical about it. And jazz is made up of elements. And one of the elements of jazz is blues. And blues is music of slaves. That's where it came from. So I can see why it came from deep in the South. So blues is essentially the core of jazz. And you can also see how New Orleans is kind of a cross between black people and European, French people. So, and that really is jazz. It's like European and African American. That's jazz. That's why you can relate to all the early jazz, because it's essentially just slick blues.
It's almost like it's happy blues.
Yeah, I mean, unless they start playing in a minor key, and then you get the devil going.
Well, it seems to like for me, the blues is dun 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 dun.
Yeah, it is the blues.
But that doesn't sound to me like jazz. So I don't maybe understand the bridge from blues to jazz. Like, how did that happen?
Well, that dun 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 dun, that's just a riff leading into a chord. And that chord is the same chord that they're playing, and then they go to another chord, and it's probably a similar chord. You know what I mean? Like, it's rooted in the same concept. Basically, that's the thing. Jazz, you could say, jazz is all about improvisation, but it's just not some sort of lunatic in a room making noises. I mean, this is improvisation based off of a tradition. It's a tradition it's a studied tradition. And once you understand the tradition and the vocabulary and the language of the genre, then you can improvise. But you can't just improvise over in the jazz setting unless you know what you're playing. It's like classical music. If you took classical music and just started making stuff up over it, you'd have to know the classical music in the first place. You couldn't just make it up. You know what I mean? I don't know. Anyway,
Wikipedia.
What was I saying?
I don't know, but Wikipedia says that jazz is characterized by swing and blue notes.
Yeah, Wikipedia's a cracker.
Call and response vocals, polyrhythms, and improvisation.
Blue notes. I would really like to know what defines a blue note.
Well, what's swing is the happier stuff. Dixieland is swing, right? Or does it all
I'm just
swing?
saying, a note is only blue in reference to what chord it's positioned against.
I guess I don't. I have. You've lost me. I don't know what that means.
I mean, an A sounds like an A, but if it's played against an E, it sounds like something different.
I see.
It sounds like an A with an E underneath it. It doesn't just sound like an A with an A underneath it. So it's not the note. It's the chord. It's juxtapositioned against.
All right, that's a little too deep, I think.
Yeah, no, but jazz is deep, but it's also supposed to be simple. See, at the core of jazz, it's just a swinging beat, and blues changes. But then it has many other. That's just at the core. Then it gets inverted and twisted, and I mean it's harmonic and it's rhythmic, so it's very deep. That's why jazz musicians have such a bad attitude, because you got to be a genius to really do it well, and then you look down upon the people who don't understand it.
Is that what you do? Is that this?
I'm not a genius. I'm just saying, true great jazz musicians. I'm more of like a jack of trades. I dabble, you know. I'm more of a session kind of guy. I'm not a bebop or a jazz master. There are guys like that, you know what I mean? That's like, they live and breathe that. They wouldn't listen to pop music. If you wanted to learn jazz, you wouldn't even listen to pop music. Jazz only on your turntable, only on your Walkman, whatever it was. That's all you would have. If you wanted to really be that, that's what you had to do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be authentic. But in being that, you become an asshole. I mean, it's true. It really is.
I see that you're not kidding. So after these guys and Dixieland, is Louis Armstrong came?
Yeah, to cut to the chase, then you get into Louis Armstrong, and you know, at some point, basically, like these bands, you know, at some point the tuba turned to a string bass.
Oh, okay.
And
when did that happen?
And at the same time, the drum set turned to the drum parts turned to a drum set, a trap set, which I'm thinking this happened around 1910, 1915, I would think. That's my estimate without looking it up.
So it was just a single drum here and there?
No, it was like, one guy would play the bass drum with a beater, holding it like a marching drum. One guy would play the snare. There'd be other guys playing cymbals.
Are you saying before jazz there were no drum sets? No one played a drum set? In any music?
I believe there might have been some sort of drum sets in Africa, but not like what we think of them as. I doubt that there was anyone playing with their... I really don't think that any culture played hands and feet like that. You'd have a set of drums, that you play with your hands. Yeah, drumsticks and a kick pedal and a hi-hat. That's an American invention. That comes around 1920 or something.
Wow. What year was Louis Armstrong the face of jazz, basically?
I would say Louis Armstrong was like the early mid-20s all the way up to when he died, but mid-20s to the 50s was his height. Mid-20s to the 60s, I guess.
And that was just...
Yeah, I mean, he died in 72 or something, so...
And he played specifically what kind of jazz?
He played specifically, I would say, swing blues jazz. Louis Armstrong got a lot of flack from black people.
Why?
Because they saw him as a sellout, almost as like an Uncle Tom, the way he would shuck and jive, in their opinion. You know, he made movies and he'd smile at the camera and make big eyes and dance around. You know, they considered him a sellout, but honestly, they can go fuck themselves. He was great and completely talented, amazingly nice guy, influenced generations of players, and smoked a lot of weed.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, he's like the pride of the Queens. You know, he was like Queens. There's a whole neighborhood of people in Queens basically like moved there because of him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, jazz musicians.
So
I bet Marcus Miller wouldn't have lived in Queens if it wasn't for Louis Armstrong.
The next number we're going to swing for you is one of the good old favorites. That's Dinah. Look out there, boy. Are you ready? Look out.
Jazz is not one thing. It's like jazz there's many elements of jazz, and jazz elements can be applied to other music, you know, and it shines in other music.
like what kind of elements are you talking about?
Like harmonic qualities or rhythmic qualities. Like jazz doesn't have to just be what one person thinks of it as, but it can't be, it's not, you know when it's not jazz.
Well, when is it jazz?
In my opinion, is jazz when you have a form that you establish and then you improvise intelligently based on that form, rhythmically and harmonically. It's logic. It's not, like jazz is really like about like taking the original chords and superimposing and implying other chords that relate to those chords.
Jesus Christ.
Like you could almost play chords. You could play a whole song based off one song. And if you knew what the first song was, you'd know why this second song was being played. But if you just heard the second song without knowing why it was being played, you wouldn't, you know what I mean? Like, that's a complicated thing. Like, in other words, like if you're playing a one chord and then you take another chord and play it on top of it, that chord is being played on top of it for a reason.
Because it's leading to the next song?
No, because it relates to that chord and perhaps the next chord it's leading into.
Oh my God. This seems like, honestly, this seems like it's work to listen to jazz.
Well, it's like a puzzle.
Well, exactly.
It's like a quilted puzzle.
So the enjoyment you get out of jazz is not the same as you get listening to something else. It's a different kind of listening experience. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure. I think it's different for everyone. The thing is, I'm not even like a real like. I'm not harmonically educated to that degree. I can hear it, but I don't know what it is. Some people can't even hear it. I've heard it enough. I'm a drummer, really, who can play other instruments, but I'm not like a jazz piano player.
When you say you can hear it, what is it? The chord stuff?
Yeah, the chords and the quality of the chords and how how substitutes are used, how you substitute a chord in here and how a logic, the logic of a chord progression, how one thing's leading, how a passing chord leads to another chord, why you would have this voicing. I can hear a lot of it, but I couldn't put it into words telling you what those were. I don't know, like, I couldn't say for sure, like, that's a flat fifth or that's a sharp 11th or whatever. I'm not a piano player or even a jazz guitar player. But I can hear it and I know enough about it to know what I'm talking about.
And you enjoy it, though.
Yeah, and I can play music. If I play drums, I know how to play based on what I'm hearing, so that I can play intelligently based upon not just the rhythm, but also harmonically, hopefully.
All right. So tell me about the bebop. What is the difference between what Louis Armstrong was playing and bebop? And
right,
you know what? Why don't you give me an example of bebop real quick?
Play Dizzy Gillespie, Night in Tunisia.
Okay, so bebop is where jazz took a turn.
As Louis Armstrong pointed out, which is even before the free jazz movement of the 60s and late 50s, he thought that bebop was Chinese music. In other words, he could not understand that music. He, being a jazz master, couldn't relate to that. So how the hell is the average person going to relate to it? And it just got more and more out there until it got back in.
That's right where I think I'm with Louis Armstrong, and it takes a turn there. According to Wikipedia, it says that bebop developed as the younger generation of jazz musicians expanded the creative possibilities of jazz beyond the popular dance-oriented swing style with a new musician's music that was not as danceable and demanded close listening. As bebop was not intended for dancing, it enabled the musicians to play at faster tempos.
That and heroin.
So, I thought heroin kind of slowed you down.
Yeah, man, it slows it down so you can play faster.
Is that what happens?
Yeah, they said it made time stand still.
Okay. So,
This drummer said this. Drummer said that they could play faster when they were on heroin because it made everything slower.
that's crazy.
I don't know. Yeah, that is crazy. But, proof's in the pudding. That and the heroin.
So,
No, but seriously, what jazz? Okay, now what happened was bebop came in. They sped it up. The music got faster, and the chords got more complicated. And this is what I'm saying. Like, they would take a standard, which is like, say, a song from Broadway, like a Broadway play song.
Right.
And they would take each chord of the song and substitute another chord that was harmonically based off of that chord, but just removed slightly. So, essentially, they created other songs, or they would just take the regular they would take those chords, maybe alter them slightly, but they would take the chords of a standard and just put new melodies over it. But when you put those melodies over it, like I said, a note is only blued based on what chord it's juxtapositioned against. They would take different melodies against those other old chords, and in doing so, you create a whole nother harmonic value. That right there is a good example of, like taking some standard chords and superimposing a new melodic concept on top of it to create what is basically the language of bebop. Anyway, so what I was saying is bebop came in, and then it started to get a little freer. John Coltrane started playing. Coltrane took what Charlie Parker and Dizzy were doing and took it to the next level, and it got even more out there to the average person's ear.
So after bebop came hard bop?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a distinction. Let's just say that bebop then became free jazz, essentially.
Okay.
The next revolution was free jazz, and free jazz is like Ornette Coleman, and then also more like John Coltrane and like Eric Dolphy. Like Eric Dolphy's "Out to Lunch" is like the essential free jazz album. Perfect example of where bebop kind of went after. This is what bebop kind of morphed into. It's all based in tradition. Like you could hear some Ornette Coleman where it's completely out there. And then you could also hear Ornette Coleman where he can actually play real music. So he knew what he was doing. It's not like just some lunatic in a room blowing a horn. This is an educated cat playing stuff that's so complexly removed. It's hard to hear unless you know where it's coming from. And where it's coming from could be like 3 times removed to start with. Free jazz could be like maybe 5-6 steps away from like the blues.
All right, where does Miles Davis fit in all this?
Miles was a bebop player who also reinvented himself over and over again. Miles is one of the most important people in modern music, in my opinion.
Not just modern jazz, just modern music altogether.
Yep, modern music altogether. Because without Miles, you wouldn't have Prince, you wouldn't have Hendrix, you wouldn't have any of that. You wouldn't have the Allman Brothers, you wouldn't have any of that shit. Well, Miles and Coltrane. The Allman Brothers were so influenced by my favorite things, John Coltrane, that without that, they wouldn't have even probably formed the way they did. Dwayne, I just think, I don't know. I don't know the specifics of it, but I know that they were heavily influenced by My Favorite Things, Coltrane. And listen to My Favorite Things and then listen to, In Memory of Elizabeth Reed. You can hear how it's like they're influenced by it. Coltrane gapped bebop and rock fusion. We'll put on In Memory of Elizabeth Reed. Coltrane would take a chord or two and he would jam on it. They would play over it and just play on it for 15 minutes, 20 minutes over the same changes. Well, that's the Allman Brothers.
So jazz kind of started jam bands.
Yeah, Allman Brothers are heavy jazz rock, but
really?
So heavily into the blues rock side of it that it's hard to tell that they're jazz rock. But yeah, without Coltrane, there's no Allman Brothers. Absolutely. Bebop was one thing, but then Coltrane, who was a bebop player, also then ushered in that new thing, which was whatever you want to call it, hard bop, or I don't know what you call Coltrane. Anyway, he's like the next cultural revolution before like fusion. And without Miles, there's no Coltrane, and without Dizzy and Charlie Parker, there's no Miles. Not the way it is, not the way he was.
So you're saying that John Coltrane came after Miles?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to Miles then. Let's not skip over that.
Miles was like an 18-year-old when he started playing with like Dizzy and Charlie Parker and those cats. Around 19 Miles. Dizzy and Charlie Parker started rocking it around 1940, 41. A lot of their shit's not on record, though, because there was a record ban for, I think it was like 40 42 to 44 or something like that. Something to do with the war.
Oh, the war. Okay, they needed the products or something.
Yeah, I don't know. They weren't allowed to record for like 2 years. So like the early development of bebop is not documented as well as it should be because of the recording ban. Pretty bad time to ban recording, unfortunately.
Well, I think they probably needed...
the acetate.
Is that
the original recordings were on acetate.
They needed something. You talk about the war, but people were really asked to give shit up.
They started making drum sets,
spam, and all that.
Drum
shit.
sets were made of metal. Then the war came along, and they had to make all the drum sets parts out of wood. They couldn't. There's limited edition drum sets from the 40s that all the hardware, the cymbal stands, are all made of wood because they weren't legally allowed to use metal.
There you go.
Insane.
Can you imagine people today, the kids today, being told that they can't do this or that because they need to help
rations or whatever?
Yeah. You know how that would go down? Not at all. So let's talk more about Miles, since you seem to think he's singularly one of the most important people in music. He started off bebop and then went to the freeform. Free jazz?
No, I would say that Miles did. Miles started off as a student of bebop, and then he put out an album called Birth of the Cool. That album is sort of like legendary, and I can't exactly tell you why, but that kind of ushered in this whole new sort of like thing. That album is like a collector's item. If you can get that, it's like worth a lot of money. The original vinyl. History sees Birth of the Cool as like the start of this new sort of like music, or new take on bebop.
It was originally on 78.
Like you dig, like check Miles Davis. Like he came out of, like I said, he came out of Dizzy and Charlie Parker's thing, and Thelonious Monk, and that tradition. And then basically like Birth of the Cool is that. But then he put out an album called Kinda Blue, and Kinda Blue is kind of like the definitive jazz album of all time. Anyone who's like slightly into jazz, they'll probably say Kinda Blue is their favorite album. Like Owen Benjamin, Kinda Blue, his favorite jazz album.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like what you would think of a cool jazz as. It's almost like cool, smooth jazz before jazz was smooth. And that's a whole other thing, like smooth jazz, like elevator music, like that sort of like started in the 1960s with like bossa nova, like bossa jazz, like A.C. Jobim, the Girl from Ipanema.
Jobim.
Jobim. It's like user-friendly, kind of like really like easygoing rhythm that you can relate to.
That's probably what I like.
So that's like after all this shit, after all this like free jazz, hard jazz, blah 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 jazz that drives you crazy, then it's like somehow like they were like, oh, we can like please people with this kind of like bossa beat, and like bossa nova kind of like took over jazz for a while.
Olha que coisa mais linda, mais cheia de graça, ela menina que vem que passa, doce balanço, caminho do mar. moça do corpo.
That's actually ushered in with Dizzy Gillespie. Like, he's a pioneer of he is the one basically who's famous for fusing Latin music and jazz.
Oh, why? Did he go down there or something? Or?
I'm not sure if he went down there, but he played with cats in New York who were real authentic guys from West Africa. This one guy named Chano Pozo.
But that's not Latin.
It's Afro-Cuban.
I see.
So it is Latin.
I see.
There's interesting there. Yeah, it's Latin. Anyway, it's what we know as Latin. It's like the basis of what we know as Latin music, Latin jazz. So yeah, Miles, like I said, when Cool Kind of Blue, like that kind of sums up what Miles like it's hard to say. Miles, like, that's the thing. Miles reinvented himself over and over again. And okay, so there's Birth of the Cool. He kind of like did a thing with that influenced a lot of people. And then Kind of Blue totally influenced a whole nother bunch of people. Then he gets this quartet with Tony Williams and Herbie Hancock in the 60s, and he once again changed his jazz with this whole new sound. Really, really aggressive, fast jazz. There's a ton of records that they put out in the mid-'60s. It's a very prolific period. Then, after that, he gets into rock jazz, and he does Bitches Brew, which is, again, an insanely revolutionary album, like totally influential. And if you look at Bitches Brew, like all the musicians on it basically went on to form like what we know as like the godfathers of fusion. Because it's got Chick Corea, who did Return to Forever, Billy Cobham from Mahavishnu's orchestra, John McLaughlin, Mahavishnu Orchestra. It's just like everyone who went on to become huge in fusion like got their start in Miles's band. That's the insane thing. You can trace the roots of all this like crazy music to Miles. Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter. Wayne Shorter was the sax player for Miles's quartet with Tony Williams in the 60s, and Wayne Shorter then goes on to form Weather Report with Jocko and Zawinul. And Weather Report is like, the best fusion there is. That's like jazz rock fusion, you know what I mean? Like that's a whole nother thing.
Wow. So
without Miles, though, none of that shit.
And each one of these, I guess these, they're kind of like jazz shoot-offs.
Yeah.
Do they still exist out there? Are there people still doing bebop and people still doing free jazz and people still doing fusion?
Definitely people still doing it. Some of the younger people doing it, like Snarky Puppy.
What kind of jazz do they do?
No, they do like shithead jazz. No,
what? Are you serious?
No. They can do the kind of jazz that you listen to like with headphones on.
Oh, is
like
that...
if you like smoke, you get like executed.
What? What are you talking about?
Yeah, they're like kind of jazz. Like if you're in the audience and you like chew too loudly, they escort you out and like give you a mark against you on your report card.
What are you talking? You're out of your mind.
It's college jazz.
Oh, okay. I don't know what you're talking about.
That being said, they're great players. This is the new generation. Each generation's chops get sicker and sicker, Doesn't mean they have more soul or they can swing any better, but they can certainly play around circles. Van Halen can play circles around Eric Clapton. Doesn't mean he's bluesier.
No. I gotcha.
But yeah, there's guys doing it now. And there's also guys doing, there's a whole school of like young guys who just play, 1940s bebop.
Okay.
But they have an attitude problem because if you try and play anything else, they look down upon you.
Who are these guys? Have you played with them?
Like guys like Jesse and other cats, Jesse's a little bit better because he's multi-influenced. Just guys with attitudes, who, like, this is the thing, like, the 40s was happening in the 40s.
Right.
It's not happening in 70 years later.
You're not going to get that big of a crowd to come and
it's
see.
It's just stale. You're reproducing something that's not. It's cool, but it's been done. You can't innovate something that's already been done. You can carry on the tradition.
Right.
But people would get mad at Miles for playing, rock fusion. They want him to play like he played in the 40s and in the 80s. And he was like, I already did that. He's like, I'd rather die than have to reproduce that shit. You know what I mean? That was his art then.
Right.
To force him to redo it if he's not feeling it. Like he did. He's like, I did that. You guys, move on.
So Miles pretty much every time he put out a record or two, he changed the direction of jazz.
Yeah, that's pretty true. That is pretty true.
The direction of jazz.
He was so popular that he did, yeah. And that's not to say that, like I said, it's not to say that there's not other guys who are as good as him or even more talented or more fluent or, there's probably more talented players. There probably always were, but Miles had the common sense to get the right players around him in his band, and he also had the ability to absorb what was popular in culture and put his twist on it. And he always did that, from Sinatra to Hendrix.
I see.
Yeah, like Miles loved Sinatra.
Good.
But, if you wouldn't know that unless you listen closely to his phrasing. And then you can hear, like, he's kind of phrasing like Sinatra in some cases. Like when Miles, in the 50s, Miles played perhaps his best.
And that was bebop? Or not bebop, that was free jazz?
No, this is, yeah, I mean, for Miles, that was like, I guess what you would call hard bop. Or, yeah, it was like bebop, but it's a little more... It's a little more inside, actually.
The Kind of Blue years, is that what you're talking about?
Just before Kind of Blue. This is like 1955, 1954. Kind of Blue is like 1960.
Now, tell me...
1959.
What is jazz like today? Is there more fusion? Is it something else? Or has it stopped? And it's where it was... And there's more people playing it, but there hasn't been another evolution of it.
I would say that there is... No, I don't think there's another well... There's been a couple of things in jazz that have happened.
Like what?
Like Indian music kind of got fused in with jazz a little bit. Like
really?
Indian rhythms. So sort of Indian music, like Middle Eastern Indian kind of music. That got fused in there, kind of started in the 80s and the 90s, 2000s.
Is that called anything?
I don't know what that's called, but you'll find like odd groupings of rhythms, odd time signatures. Sometimes you'll have tablas in there, like Indian drums. And then on the other side of things, you have like the cross between hip-hop and jazz. You'll have hip-hop music, kind of jazz musicians who also understand hip-hop, and that's part of the sound. And that's like this guy Chris Daddy Dave. That's like the new generation of music, of like drummers. Zach Danziger, Chris Daddy Dave. Like, that's, in my opinion, like the new evolution of jazz.
So it is evolving.
Yeah, but it's a small market.
Yeah.
It's a small market, and
niche.
It's I don't know. It's evolving, but there was a time when jazz was like popular music.
Right.
And I don't think it hasn't been like that since the 60s.
Since Kenny G.
Yeah, Kenny G. He's rough.
You think he's rough?
He's a rough one.
That album was popular.
Yeah, he's not really...
Why do you have a problem with Kenny G? Just because he's...
Well, sometimes he sounds out of tune to me.
I see.
But other than that, his music is really wimpy. It's really inside.
What do you mean by inside?
It's like it's very like soft. It's very vanilla. It's like it doesn't take chances. It's not edgy. It's very smooth. You know what I mean? It's almost like elevator music.
Right. Oh, it's smooth jazz.
Yeah, it's very like user friendly. Like it's a formula, and from what I've heard, he's happy to do that. He's content.
Maybe it's mellow for him.
He's content to be that. Pat Metheny, who's one of the greatest guitar players ever. You can like him or not.
Okay.
Has a lot to say about Kenny G.
Well, I can understand why a lot of people say they don't like jazz, because right now, sometimes you say the word jazz and people think of some of the worst music on earth, like, for instance, Kenny G. I mean, there's nothing more stupid than that. Let's face it. That's the dumbest music there ever could possibly be in the history of human beings. There could never be music any worse than that. And now people think that that's what jazz is. Well, that's not what jazz is at all. Jazz is, at its best, the most incredible music. It's just that, like in rock and roll, 95% of it really sucks.
Particularly, I don't even like Pat Metheny.
Oh, I thought you loved him.
Stiff motherfucker.
Oh, shit. Well, maybe that's why he doesn't like Kenny G. Kenny G told him he was stiff.
I don't know.
Maybe he's going to say bad
Pat
shit about you
Metheny,
too.
more like Pat my weenie. Am I right?
No.
Oh.
I mean, I just feel like the guy was successful. Good on him. People seem to enjoy it. I don't own that record, but...
Look, I happen to know Kenny G's real name is Kenny Gorlick.
He's of your tribe.
He's of my tribe, so I have the right to criticize him.
Oh, okay.
That being said, I like Kenny G on the first Jeff Lorber album, which is where he came out of Jeff Lorber Fusion. That's good stuff. But quite frankly, Kenny G's probably the worst part of that record.
Well, it's just like Yanni. There are people that love Yanni, but I'm sure that there are also people who have plenty to say about Yanni.
There's a lot of people like Mr. Sweaty's balls too.
I'm just saying that there's an appeal there, and if he's happy making that music, then why would you even bother to criticize him? Who cares?
No, I wouldn't criticize him. I'm not. I wouldn't really criticize him. I was just surprised at how much Pat Metheny criticized him. Perhaps because I don't know why.
Maybe he owes Pat Metheny a 20. I don't know. So
maybe Pat Metheny's losing out on gigs because of music like Kenny G. I mean, that is possible, Who wants to hear this fucking revolutionary shit where you can play it safe with a formula?
Well, the truth of the matter is as you've been explaining it and as we've been listening along, there is a clear line for me of what's enjoyable and what is not enjoyable, or not enjoyable, but it's it almost seems hard to listen to. Like the Jazz Is Dead was I didn't recognize any of those songs, and you've explained it now, and I see why I didn't. All right. Well, this has been. I'm sure there's more stuff out there that you will remember as soon as we hit stop, but that's fine.
Check. Wait, I got one more for you.
Okay.
Donald Fagen, Bright Lights, Big City. Now, this minute or 2 minute long clip is one of my favorite endings to a movie.
I see.
And the song has so much jazz in it, but it's not actually jazz.
Brad, what was your first clue? Can I have some? Just a roll or something?
Get out of here.
Traded my sunglasses.
Bright lights, big city. Went to my baby's head. I tried to tell the woman, but she don't believe a word I said.
It's 6 a.m. on the island of Manhattan. In the dawn's early light, you can imagine the first ship from the old world sailing slowly up the biggest river they had ever seen. That was almost how you felt the first time you saw the city from the window of a Greyhound, like you were looking at a new world waiting to be discovered. And that's how it looks to you now. But you have to go slowly. You'll have to learn everything all over again.
Why is it jazzy but not jazz?
Well, a side note, all the comments on that video are about 9/11.
Yeah, well, I can see why.
Well, first of all, the horn arrangement on that is amazing. The horns are just brilliant. And so the horns and the chords, basically he took a Jimmy Reed song, Bright Lights, Big City, and just made an insanely jazzy arrangement of it. So it's just got lots of elements of jazz in the chords and in the horns and the rhythm of the horns.
But then why don't you consider it to be jazz?
Because it's like blues. I see. It's blues, but it's got some jazz in it. It's jazzy blues. It's not real jazz, but it's so steeped in jazz that I don't know. That one song right there, I don't know why I can't. It's not been released. You can't find it. I gotta just watch. I've watched that clip there probably 15 times over the past 10 years, just so I can hear the song. And I love Michael J. Fox.
Yeah, who doesn't? All right, well, that's weird. that it wasn't released, but I'm pretty sure we're going to get flagged over it. And
the song
other
that was
songs
released is Century's End. That's from the movie. That's the song they did release.
Was there a soundtrack, and it's just not even on the soundtrack?
Not on the soundtrack. Century's End is on the soundtrack. Century's End is cool, but this one is, man, the horns are just so good. And that's a gospel 12/8 feel.
A gospel 12/8 feel.
That means the beat resolves after 12.
Mm-hmm. What's the 8 for?
That's the pulse underneath it.
I see.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1. That's the kind of feel. With that feel, that's where the vocals start and begin. You know what I mean? Each phrase.
I do not know what you mean, but this is why you listen to music differently than I do. This is why when we first moved up here and we were driving to Florida, you got really mad because I was singing along with Mbop. You literally were so annoyed with me. And I'm like, what? It's fun. They're cute. They're little kids. You were so angry. We were fighting about Mbop.
Fighting about Mbop.
It was absurd. But, there you go. All right. Well, this has been episode number 45 of the Middle Aged Cool Kids Super Terrific podcast featuring your pals Dave and Shecky. I finished that for you. If there was one record you would recommend for everyone, just one right now, get into jazz and listen to this record, or get into jazz by listening to this record, what is it? Go.
I don't have one. Wait, you want to give me a second?
No.
Go. I don't know. Yeah, you got me there.
There's not one record you could say. Look, if I said to you, name one record that could get you into funk, what would it be?
Man, one record?
Oh, forget it. You know what? You've just ruined everything.
All right, how about this? One record to get you into jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you check out Interesting Take on Jazz? Have a Claude Bowling Suite. Is that what it's called? Claude Bowling.
Okay, you know what? I'm not putting this in because you didn't talk about him, and all of a sudden now he's the guy that's going to get you interested in jazz.
Well, if you don't know about jazz, maybe this can ease you into it. Check him out, Claude Bowling.
No.
Come on.
I'm going to say
He's
maybe
sweet.
You guys can check out Snarky Puppy.
All right, Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. That's the one.
Or look at Snarky Puppy on YouTube. They are very good.
Don't look at them too closely. You get a grade mark against you. You get escorted out of class.
All right.
Hashtag Snarky Me Puppy, too.
All right. Anyway, it's been great, and I hope you enjoy this episode, and we will see you next time, America.
Take it easy.